Hello and good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Joseph Dunne-Howrie. I'm the principal investigator of the Gaming Democracy Project. I run the project with my colleague Tom Drayton, who unfortunately can't be here this evening. But I'm delighted to have as our panelists for tonight Kesia Guillery. Kesia, would you like to appear?
Hello.
Hello, and we have Georg Hobmeier.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, Georg. If you've been to a Gaming Democracy webinar before, thank you for coming back. It's wonderful to see you. I see some familiar names. If this is your first event, welcome. Welcome to the project. I'm going to be sharing the YouTube recordings of the other two webinars during the event in the chat, and I'll point you to those when I do. And in the first one, that gives a kind of more comprehensive overview of the project and what we're looking at. And I'm going to give a very quick introduction before we get into the event properly. So the way that tonight will work, I'm going to as I say, briefly introduce the project, what its research questions are, how are we approaching investigating this topic of the intersection between the far right, gaming, and theatre. And then just give you a brief rundown of the provocations and questions that Tom and I gave Kesia and Georg in preparation for tonight. These were not instructions, they were just sort of stimuluses to get us talking about game theatre and hybrid artworks and how live events are all changing in the era of Web 2.0. Then Kesia and Georg will each give a short presentation. We'll have a quick discussion about that, and then we'll go into a Q&A. But we really would like this to be as interactive as possible. So whenever you feel the need, do talk in the chat amongst yourselves. Or if you want to pose a question to the panel, please use the Q&A button at the bottom, and we'll come to those in the last kind of half hour of the evening. So without further ado, I will start. Just to let everyone aware that this webinar is being recorded. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Now, last time I did this, it all went horribly wrong. So so fingers crossed, this will work from beginning. Oh, I've lost the player. Sorry, hang on. See that. So Kesia or Georg, please let me know, can you see that PowerPoint open?
Yes.
And then if I do this, has it gone to full screen now? It has, great. The Gaming Democracy Project brings together scholars, artists and activists working in the fields of participatory theatre, new media, gaming, criminology and sociology. The network is investigating the global far-right gamification of extremist politics and exploring how theatre and the arts can model new forms of democracy. And as I said, you can find more detailed information about the project in the video to the first webinar, which I will share in the chat. So to come to this evening's event, just a bit of background, games and theatre have a long history. So practitioners like Augusto Boal and Clive Barker recognised in the mid-20th century that games can release and act as creative energies, whilst also acting as the building blocks for ensembles, which is particularly useful for devising. Both Boal and Barker, and others as well, like Viola Spolin, recognised and argued that games possessed a political dimension through their capacity to work against determinist models of social behaviour and could also, in a way, embody ideal communities, which is certainly important for Clive Barker. And then later, blast theory pioneered the incorporation of digital media and game mechanics in shows such as Uncle Roy All Around You and Can You See Me Now in the early 2000s. These hybrid artworks explored how mobile technologies and Web 2.0 were transforming our social realities into mediated encounters between digital entities in online and offline environments. Game theatre today has become a diverse yet relatively porous concept, encapsulating immersive experiences, interactive design, LARPs, and augmented reality. And as we've spoken before in these webinars, even immersive experiences is a huge umbrella, encompassing everything from one-to-one shows to secret cinema, to large-scale theatre events pioneered by groups like Punch Drunk. Interpreting the wider context of digital culture, game theatre embodies how traditional artistic mediums now exist in a very fluid state. Artworks are now able to connect and interact as easily as human beings. Computer games and the online subcultures that spin off from them on social media have become key battlegrounds in online culture wars. And this is an oversimplification, but this can be traced back to the Gamergate controversy, where alt-right figures like Milo Yiannopoulos came to public attention. In the imagination of reactionary young men on far-right message boards like 8chan and Gab, computer games represent a refuge for men, and it's really white men. As the rest of culture has been feminized, so computer games become this kind of church almost, this retreat from the real world where men can be so-called real men, which means that misogyny and transphobia is justified as a defense against the presence of women and non-gender conforming people on the sacred ground for white men. So that paints a rather dark picture of computer games and politics, but we at Gaming Democracy are also interested in the potential of gameplay in political contexts to build alternative worlds through cooperation, empathy, and commitment to equality. Is it possible, we're asking, in this webinar particularly, for the enhanced feeling of agency that some interactive performance architectures can engender in players be carried over into everyday social reality to achieve progressive political ends? And these are some of the questions that the webinar will explore. And I know that Kesia and Georg have a lot more. So this is just a kind of framing for the event. These are not strict questions. This is just what we started with. So I will stop sharing now. And we will start, please, with Kesia. Would you like to go into your presentation?
Yes. Okay. Hello. And thank you very much for having me. I'm going to do the whole screen share shenanigan. Okay. Are you seeing my slide? Slide that says ZG UK. Yes, great. Okay. Yeah, it's been great to see the webinars so far, and I think you'll see in a moment as I start chatting that what I am going to say has definitely been impacted by what has come before, and the way that I am thinking about my responses to these prompts has kind of emerged from what I've been hearing. I am Kesia Guillery. I'm currently working as a research associate with a company called ZG UK, which is the company that came through a background of interactive theatre making, and were associated in the early 2000s with what kind of came to be known as the first wave of the UK immersive theatre, but now define most of what they make not necessarily as theatre, but as interactive performance and digital art experiences with a lot of influence from game and game structures. And the company is run by Persis Maravala and Georg Lopez Ramos. And the work focuses on experiences that are made for, by, and with people who might often feel excluded from establishment arts and theatre spaces. And to this purpose, a lot of it takes place in public spaces. It might be cafes, shopping centres, or in the home or local area of the participants. And it often uses accessible digital technology as ways of increasing reach and of reaching all kinds of people. And what ties the work together that ZU UK make, I think, is that the pieces are always experiences in which audiences or participants' creative contributions, and I mean that quite broadly, it could be creative contributions that are shared, but could also be your own private reflections that are not necessarily shared with others, and more importantly, in what ZU make, relationships between the people who are participating formed within the framework of the experience. These things make up the valuable aesthetic content of the artwork. And just a couple of examples to give an idea of the kinds of things. On the left, you have a picture of an experience called Binaural Dinner Date, which is an actual dating service in which a few couples at a time go on a date that is also an arts experience, and you are guided through the experience with the facilitation of an audio track that you're listening to, and a live performer as well, who you can see in the picture there, who's there as your waiter, guiding you through a series of games and interactions. And on the right, you can see Project Perfect Stranger, which is a WhatsApp-based experience in which over the course of a week, you're put in contact with an anonymous stranger on WhatsApp and guided through some prompts and instructions through a creative collaborative relationship with the stranger. And Radio Ghost, which is a game experience. It's an app on that you play on your mobile phone with 3 players in a shopping centre. It's also audio led, and it's about ethical consumption. So those are just some examples. I work with the company in various capacities from a research perspective, and my background as well as in theatre making and interactive theatre making, sometimes in more conventional theatre spaces, and sometimes things more akin to LARP design and games. Great. So yes, Joe's already shown you the main prompts that we were looking at as we were coming up to this webinar, and I'm going to really zoom in on the one that I've made nice and big there. What is the potential of game theatre to act as a space for people to play in alternative political realities? And I think that maybe obliquely, as I go through, I'm kind of coming up with some provocations that respond to the other prompts as well. And my main answer is coming in the form of a provocation. So my answer to that question, what is the potential of game theatre to act as a space for people to play in alternative political realities, is that co-creative story making is, or can be, it's quite important, a microcosmic democratic activity in itself. And I mean story making here quite broadly in the sense of sense making. So I want to encompass fictional, fantastical experiences right from the end of the spectrum. That is a kind of committed LARPing community, dressing up in elaborate costumes in a fictional role and developing relationships and storylines over the course of years, to something more like what ZU UK do, where you're rarely going into something with a fictional role that is different from your own identity. You go in as yourself, but you try on different roles in relation to the people that you are with, and you collaboratively build some kind of a narrative and some kind of a thread of sense together. And my argument is that this kind of experience is something that merging game and theatre forms and traditions can allow for. And I'm building it on things that have come up in the other webinars in terms of game and theatre systems as vehicles for political discourse. So Wes spoke in the first about procedural rhetoric and game systems allowing us to set up rule systems that comment on real world politics by way of allegory. And Malika was calling for game and theatre as ways of providing, it's a phrase I noted down because it was really neat, reflective, imaginative, pluralist spaces for actual political discourse. And I want to agree that these uses of game and theatre forms are useful and transformative. But I want to dig in a bit further and zoom in on the act itself of co-creative sense making as actually democratically constructive. Rather than only thinking about game and theatre as vehicles, as a kind of instrumental activity towards rehearsing skills for democracy or commenting on our political systems. And in order to do so, I want to invite you to take part in a collective story-making activity by way of illustration and also just so that we have something silly and fun to do together. So we have a quick, super simple story making game. You have here a picture to fire up your beautiful imaginations, and you have the beginning of a story. The beginning of the story goes as follows. It has now been 2 years since we moved here. Leaving Earth was tough, but we are beginning to feel more at home with every single week that passes. So in a moment, you're going to have about 40 seconds to write the next sentence of the story, if you would like to. And you're going to write it first privately, so on a piece of paper, going analog, or open up your notepad on your computer. So not in the chat to start with, you're going to write it privately. So I'm going to give everybody a few seconds to get ready, to find a pen, a piece of paper, open up your notepad, whatever it is you're doing. Okay, and you've got some music to accompany you with your writing. Off you go, let's make it juicy. Okay, so next step is, if your first name begins with an S, a P, an R, or an O, and you are happy to share your sentence, could you please put your sentence into the chat? We'll see whether we have enough people with first names beginning with S, P's, R's, and O's. Okay, we've got one, which is plenty. So the story so far goes, it has now been 2 years since we moved here. Leaving Earth was tough, but we are beginning to feel more at home with every single week that passes. Mind you, I wish I knew where the cat has got to. Okay, so we're going to take this one as our next sentence of the story. And in a minute, we're all again going to write the next fourth sentence of the story, following on from Rupert's contribution. Mind you, I wish I knew where the cat has got to. But first, before you do that, I'm going to give you one more piece of information about the story. So you didn't know this, but the title of this story is actually Utopia. So now you know. the title of the story is Utopia. And you are going to have another 40 seconds to privately, not yet in the chat, write the next 4th sentence of this story.
Kesia, sorry, Siobhan's just written one as well.
Oh, we've got another
that?
one. Okay,
Yeah.
in which case, it is up to you to choose which one of these sentences you're going to carry on for. So we also have bat like we live in the upside down. Like we live in the upside down. I love it. I love it. It's surreal. Okay. Okay, and we're up. So anybody who has participated, you should now have the very promising and potentially politically revolutionary and radical beginning of a new story called Utopia. I'm going to carry on talking now and making the points that I'm going to make about this. But if you would like to share your whole story beginning, I encourage anybody who'd like to post it into the chat, and you can copy, if you copy both sentences so we know which one that you've carried on from including the one from the first round, plus your final sentence, then yes, you'll all have something fun to distract yourselves with whilst I carry on warbling. So the point that I wanted to sort of glibly make off the back of this exercise is that although I gave you a prompt in the second part that made it explicitly, if crudely, political, explicit about imagining better social futures, in my book, the first part was just as politically rich as the second, because what you get from the kind of process that this was a very basic prototype of are some of these things. You get co-creation. We made something together, very simply. You have investment in co-creation and in a group activity. So the act of putting something of yourself into the group activity, just even if it was just a sentence, and even if you didn't share the sentence, you'd written a sentence and you had invested something of yourself in the group if you participated. Or if you chose not to participate, then you chose not to invest. You have the formation of a temporary community. We became a group, and we very simply were trying on ways of relating to each other within that group. And you have a story making process, which I want to interpret broadly as, again, sense making. So we, by combining sentences, are calibrating our understandings of things, of what it might mean to talk about utopia, but prior to that, just calibrating our understandings of this picture and what it might mean to us, and coming up with new understandings. And I want to say that these things make up a kind of mini democratic practice, because this kind of activity, especially if it's a little bit more developed than what we just did, builds constructive connectivity, which in an increasingly globalized but fragmented world is extra important, and you are building collective understandings of things. And the picture that you have here is from a LARP that took place in Oslo that I participated in designing part of, which was very explicitly a political allegory. It was based on an Ursula Le Guin story about some people forming an anarchist society on another planet and then returning to Earth to see how people are getting on here and talking about differences. So I won't talk about that at length, but just to clarify that yes, there are theatre and game-based activities that we can engage in that are super edifying and transformative because we are using them as direct allegories or using them as spaces for explicitly imagining new political possibilities. But I found it a little bit harder to try and think of, so what is an example of this, not so explicitly political content that I want to talk about and why it is so useful. And the example that in the end I've settled on talking about is a game that I played with some friends several times during the pandemic and lockdown period. It's a game of Harry Potter Werewolf, and I played it twice as a player and once as the game master, the person conducting the experience. And it was a game that was played across a variety of communications platforms, essentially limitless. You're allowed to use whatever means of communication you have at your disposal. The core gameplay was done on an online forum, and then the rest, which is the really good bit, sprawled out across whatever we had. So you can see some communications on the left that were taking place on Facebook. We were using WhatsApp. We were using phone calls, anything that you like, but it was all remote because of the context. And it took place over several weeks, and many of the people, myself included, were investing hours every day. It followed a basic kind of werewolf, or some people know it as mafia format, which are games that are familiar to lots of people, but for those who might not know it, it's a kind of cyclic trying to find the bad guys kind of a game. And there's lots of intrigue and secrecy, and the bad guys are trying to kill the good guys but pass off as good guys, and then everybody together periodically comes together to try and work out who the bad guys are. But it gets a lot more complicated than that, because it can be assigned specific roles, their own motives, special powers that they might have, and it did get incredibly complicated. And then there was every day, what you can see on the right is that the game masters, who are in a way participants in the game, would create very elaborate, very rich in terms of the shared mythology that this particular group had because of knowledge of references to Harry Potter. Would come up with story content explaining what had happened, because the game masters are the only people who really know what has happened. And the game came to me and my circle from elsewhere. It was just somebody knew the game from somebody else who they played it with. The original where it had originally come from was uncertain. Just the basic structure handed over with a lot of scope for reinvention and emergent input. And not only the content on what specifically happened in the game each time was different, but the rules and the system itself were reimagined every time it was played. And what I want to draw attention to is that unanimously the people who participated in it were talking about and testifying to it as an all-consuming experience, as an exciting experience, and as a genuinely restorative experience, and one that was bringing us and many of whom were in strange dark places because of the impacts of the pandemic. They're out of these holes and into connection with each other. And this, I think, is a democratically vibrant activity and experience, because it was generating social cohesion and it was generating new ways of relating. And the fact that this example is coming from the fragmented pandemic context, I think, highlights how important this kind of thing is in a world in which we are so connected, potentially, but also so isolated, especially over the last couple of years. And what I finally want to say is that the pandemic context, I think, is also really pertinent, because it took that extreme social deprivation of the pandemic period and the time in our day-to-day created by lockdown to invest hours every day in this thing for something like this to become feasible. For that particular group. And there are LARPing and gaming communities who regularly invest similar amounts of time into similar experiences, but that is generally a luxury, and also it is often marginalized as odd because most people don't have the time for or allocate social value to this kind of collective play and narrative building. Because it is not given value socially, it is not given space because it is time consuming and because it is not monetized. And when something like this does become monetized or does become commercialized, it loses its specificity. And it's really important to me in talking about this example, how this game and the way that it unfolded would not really have been of interest to anybody other than those people who knew each other and also knew the previous runs of the game that had happened. And nothing that's specific or requiring that degree of care and creative input could be commercially successful because nobody has that time in their busy lives to indulge in it. So I guess, yes, I'm going to finish up there, but yeah, the question that we can maybe pick up later and that I want to leave people with, if you agree with me, that this kind of co-creative, playful coming together via game and role play is important, is what does a society look like that values this kind of activity, and how can we create value for this kind of activity? Thank you very much. I will leave it there.
Thank you, Kesia. It's wonderful. You made me start thinking about William Gibson's novel Pattern Recognition. Not sure if you know that. It's William Gibson is this incredible visionary. Like, he's talking about things we just take for granted now, like 20-30 years ago, to coin cyberspace with pattern recognition. A whole very early sort of message board community builds up around 3-second a film, and every few months a little fragment of film just appears online. They're constantly interpreting it, and it's just this incredible community that builds up. It's very meaningful to them. But anyway, thank you very much. So without further ado, we will definitely come address those questions, as wonderful points you raised, Kesia, in discussion. But Georg, would you like to start?
Yes, I'd be honored to. Let me just quickly start my presentation. There we go. So, I'm a very practical person, so and I'm not an academic, and as of now, I'm not even an artist anymore. So I'm going to talk about practical things, my own life, and how they relate to these particular questions, especially the things I do. I have to give you a bit of a background because I have an absolutely idiotic biography when it comes to ending up in game development, where I am right now. It started quite promising, as you can see, with Dungeons and Dragons. Well, that's a good pedigree, you know. You want to play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons if you want to go into game development. But someone told me that just because I like elves, I should go and get into drama. And this was obviously the first mistake, you know, because theater and game development, that's a very odd combination. Very different people. I did try to become an actor. I even studied at a conservatoire of a sort. I found it absolutely dreadful. And then something really strange happened. I ended up doing this, which is working with like strange technologies and performance instead. Nothing was really planned. It was all like weird, strange chains of coincidences. But this is how I actually then ended up in working with technologies, and ultimately with game development. Is like through like the strange borderlands of, well, what one might call interactive or interdisciplinary performance art. And mind you, mostly very politically one. So this anti-fascist thing, this is a very practical kind of notion of my life in the last 25 years. So most of this, would say like a probably decade of interdisciplinary performance art, I spent experimenting with different technologies, different approaches of like how to act with technologies and how technologies interact with you. As you have seen, there is this weird wires to my face. The notion of control and being controlled in the connection with these wires was always quite important. But the one thing that always bothered me immensely about creating artistic work and creating artistic work that had a political background is that I just couldn't stand the fact that I didn't reach anyone with it, and that's the reality of, let's say, like continental or Central European performance art, that you only play it for your peers. So for me, the point was completely lost. Like, why would I make political art, that 20 of my friends and 10 of my students, if I'm really lucky, get to see, and my mother who doesn't understand it. So I started doing this, working with game engines, and that turned out to be not a bad idea from the notion of reaching a broader public. So what you see right now is one of the first pieces I've done. It looks fairly ugly, but that's because it's 14 years old. There's a project called Frontiers, a computer game about the militarization of European borders, particularly in southern Spain. And through this work, I basically discovered there is a huge amount of people out there who experiment with game engines. But there's a large audience out there. So this game was actually played by 100,000 people, and seen by like a few million, one thing. So at this point, I was like, this is better than my 15 friends in the basement. And at this point, I essentially departed from the performing arts with a few exceptions. And I think I would like to disagree with my previous speaker that money prevents specificity, but this is a short and a bit rash replique, but I think that commercial work can actually be also caring, and it can also be very political. This was a bit of an attempt that we tried to do. Like the logo that you see now, that's a company that I founded, a company that made games about electronic waste recycling, particularly on the Indian subcontinent, games about Vietnamese workers in the GDR and how this community developed after the fall of the so-called Iron Curtain. In some moments, we even ended up doing purely commercial project like this visually appealing, like slightly esoteric game that is not political whatsoever. The only project in the last 12 years, mind you. And this is probably one of the most interesting one in the connection on like what we previously also like teased in the title itself. How can you fight radicalization of young adults, especially through communities like the ones that formed in Gamergate. And I think that you can only fight fire with fire. So that is my personal opinion. I think you have to speak the same language. And this is probably one of my most efficient creation in the last years is this particular project that you see right now, which is called Path Out, a adventure game about young Syrians escaped from the Syrian civil war. I could now go into like how this was received in particular circles, but the most important thing is it's now ended up in schools across Europe and reaches a demographic that is very, very often kind of not even interested in the performing arts or culture in general, but sticks to this particular medium called games. And that's my personal approach, to like meet young adults in on their own turf, so to say. Yeah, and strangely enough, like I'm showing you this with people right now. I am not like a creator, like artists are sometimes, like this is my idea. Game development is a very strange, interconnected thing. So now I ended up with this group of people. So whatever I show you right now is not my work. It's always our work. So, and in that sense, the process itself is deeply democratic, I'd say. I would like to show you two more things that are going like that are really like quite literally connected to the title. This is a bit of a well, this is my one of our personal takes on not exactly utopia, maybe kind of an ironic Austrian dystopia. This is a piece called Vienna All Tomorrows that we did with a theater, one of the rare occasions. It's actually like a myriad of micro stories that play in the future of the city of Vienna. And this is from a game testing session, and the audience becomes essentially tribunes in the classic Roman sense. So they're sent by the electorate to take care of the city. A group of 9 people, a citizens' parliament with all different ideologies, and there's a strong technical component as well. You see people staring at tablets, so there's an actual simulation underneath that lets people navigate through these stories, and there's screens and all sorts of things. Not that great in telling it, so I will just show you like a brief clip on how this democracy simulation looked like.
Sie, meine Damen und Herren, wurden unter 2 Millionen Wienerinnen und Wiener auserwählt, um uns in eine strahlende Zukunft zu führen. Es wird der Wein sein und wir werden immer sein.
So just letting you, sorry, I think my stream thing is a little stuck right now. There we go. This is already the next project. Just a few words on this. So the interesting thing about from a design perspective for us was that we had fairly simple components. We had interactive storyline that people could navigate through. There was a so-called simulation, which was really primitive, where the city was essentially being manipulated through like decisions on particular events. Do you want to build this? Do you don't want to build this? People took this decision based on factions that they belonged to, eco-utopians, technocrats, or fascists, something really popular in Austria since the last 100 years. And based on this decision, interaction would form. And the most important bit is that although the components themselves were actually quite simple, the entire combination that formed out of this was fairly complex. So when you were inside of the game and you looked at the component, you were like, well, this is a very simple design. You know, this will not create a lot of emergence. You know, this will not really be a profound simulation. But the mixture of like a simple simulation and a simple LARP became quite complex, especially in this very rich environment where people had costume, where it was like television speakers, all sorts of interactive media events, lots of interactions. So we ourselves were getting quite interested in how we could use this further. Now that we had essentially like a prototype, and since we are of the utopian kind ourselves, we thought, well, this is interesting. But then again, you know, the sad part of the whole story was that this was very short-lived. The theater didn't quite appreciate it, and we wanted to have something that has a much stronger impact. So we thought, like, well, let's move away from culture. Let's go into education, where you could actually really make change with that. And then we experimented with different use cases, and this became essentially like an ideal vehicle to communicate climate change related issues, to let people understand the profound undertakings and let them find out, not by linear media, but through interaction and also through the embodiment that comes with it. This is very early day. This project is in like the earliest possible stages, like in the concept phase, but this is essentially how this strange pseudo dystopian Viennese piece of entertainment now becomes hopefully an actual tool for real world change by becoming this particular project, Rising Tide. It's a little bit different, obviously. It's not about Vienna, it's about the planet. The topics aren't fictional. There's it's about the real world and how to make real changes. Again, with a lot of complications, obviously, because climate change is very complex, and these systems cannot be complex whatsoever. They actually need to be simple. And yeah, and there's all sorts of fancy technology underneath that is probably not that interesting for you. But yeah, at the center of it, we have the same thing as before. We have a system, a game-based system that has analog and digital components. Where people have to meet in a space and negotiate something, profoundly concerning themselves on a democratic level. How can they interact with each other, and how can they come to terms with each other with their different needs. As you can see, there's different factions, and how can they create the necessary solutions for this problem that we do have to resolve to survive as a species. I think that's a good ending point.
Yes. Oh, yes, it certainly is. Climate change. We're
all gonna die.
Yeah, we're gonna die, but we're here and loving it. Yeah, we're here. So thank you, Georg. Fascinating, wonderful stuff. Wow. Where to start with our discussion? There's so many different directions we could go in. By the way, I don't want this to people watching. I don't want this just to be like me asking panel questions. Please, anytime you want to ask a question in the Q&A, I'll pick it up. I think what I'd like to start with, though, is this point of disagreement between the two of you, because I think it's quite important. Because the one thing I should have said at the beginning, that the network is interdisciplinary, and that's very important because we're looking at how this project can be a space where people from different fields can have a conversation and hopefully a collaboration. But in order to make that meaningful, we have to identify where are the points of departure between our different fields. And I think this one is a really interesting one, if I understood it. So, Kesia, I think you said that I think it stemmed from when you said that large-scale work can sometimes fail to perhaps recognise the individuality of players or of audiences, and therefore be quite inclusive. And I think, and then Georg, I think you said that actually large scale work or commercial work can actually have bigger reach than more specialist work. So perhaps I'm sort of just throwing it in there. Who'd like to pick it up? So Kesia, perhaps Kesia, do you want to start? Why do you think that large scale work cannot have that sort of relationship of care and intimacy and maybe more complex dialogue?
I wouldn't frame it as a disagreement. I think both can be super valuable in different ways, and I think that what technology and also game formats can do in terms of increasing reach and inclusivity can be extremely valuable. If you have an experience that you think is really great and really useful, then obviously it's a great thing that you can reach as many people as possible with it. I think my point was more that the way the necessity to always scale up works, it can devalue certain things that are really valuable about experiences that maybe are highly specific to a particular community that use as to go back to the Harry Potter example that I was talking about, that use for example within a group of 20 people, knowledge of the personalities of those people, and weave that into a creative experience, and build also on as in long form LARPing, just long form pervasive structures that build on maybe years of having been part of this world and a certain system. And I think my point was that is really valuable. And I think there's really interesting things being done in terms of trying to investigate how care and specificity and intimacy can be created in scaled up ways, and a lot of the work that ZU UK is doing is looking at that as well, like using WhatsApp but designing in such a way that the relationships between individuals who might be on the other side of the world to each other are built up and intimate and specific. So yeah, I think there are all kinds of possibilities. That's what I'll say to that.
Yeah, I think it's also like there's certain terminologies in game development that are also there, especially not in Central Europe. In our preparation course, by the way, I spent about 60% of my energy to pitch about how continental Europe, is structurally fascist in culture, and how it's like not capable of creating meaningful work the way how the institutions are made. I think actually in the UK it's quite different. But I think that there's one thing I wanted to point out from the field of both digital and analog games. There is a great care on community building, on community management. This is something you do have that in theater in the UK. We don't have that in Central Europe. We don't care. People should come because our program is great, and if you don't come, you're a peasant. But in games, you have to foster how you interact with communities. What kind of value you set. And I saw it in a couple of projects, and also with friends. And some of them have massive communities. Web comics that have tens or hundreds of thousands of readers. But they themselves, although this is a bit of an odd example because it's not particularly interactive, but the communities are strongly overlapping. But here, it's really like the tone that the creators set, the way how they structure communication in the spaces they provide, mostly Discord spaces, and then what kind of communication that actually creates. And some of these communities are like incredibly, tender and caring places, where people feel safe, where they exchange and they interact. But as we all know, these kind of places can also turn cesspits of toxicity. So I think this is an interesting notion that has developed in the last 5 to 10 years. That you have to take care of these communities, because otherwise, entropy might drag them straight to hell.
And are these communities always developed from the ground up? In other words, is the community building function always seen as part of the game in the game design? And I might be asking a very stupid question coming outside of this, is this something that players were kind of inventing for themselves, like discovering that we can have this on top of our gaming experience?
I think that who was it? Eric Zimmerman, I think, wrote in his book on game design, and I think this is not like this is like an outer circle of the game's experience. This is not the game's rules or the games as play, but this is games as culture. But it is part of the game, and there is different ideologies in that. There's people who say that you have to control these environments, and then of course we are immediately in political territory. Rules, communication. Someone will yell freedom of speech and post a swastika to make his point. And here, people really digress. Obviously, someone instigates this community. But how do you control these communities? Do you have rules? Do you have no rules? And this is hugely unresolved. And this is also the reason, and now we come back to the core also of the seminar, this is the reason why we have these spaces that foster neo-Nazi and fascist ideologies, because on this massive gaming platform, Steam, for example, this is not hate speech. This is like a freedom of expression. And some people might say, that's the mistake. This is where it should not be bottoms up, and people do whatever they want, and they build their beautiful community full of Japanese manga, swastika, Hitler fangirls, because that's exactly what the world needs in 2022.
Yeah, and when you just described that these communities an outer layer, there is something comparable in performance. I've just got in mind Richard Shetner's model of theatre, and he's got these 4 structural worlds, and that's what he calls them, structural worlds, and the outer one is called performance, and it's the most ill-defined one, and that's the world of the audience. And it feels like, just in your description, and look, Kesia, I'd like to just bring you in on this as well, as sort of coming from the sort of theatre perspective, that there feels like there's a space, because with certainly in a lot of the work such as ZU, but also other interactive theatre practitioners, we want to be working with audiences over a longer duration than one event can afford. But that's very hard to kind of capture sometimes, to keep people's attention. Yet in the gaming sphere, it's just exploded. It's almost like there's too much interaction that is going unmanaged. So it feels like there is a gap between the two worlds, where one, there's not enough audience community building happening, and one where there's communities arising, but they're almost uncontrollable. And I kind of use that word uncontrollable. It sounds a bit dictatorial, but at the same time, perhaps let's talk about that. Do you think that these communities, whether we're talking in the gaming context or in sort of interactive theatre context, do we need to establish rules and conventions before we start building them, or can those conventions and rules, ethics, emerge naturally?
Yeah, that sort of brings it into starting to think about, well, what is democracy, and what is the democratic model? I guess we want to recreate in cyberspace, and yeah, I can't pretend to know the answers to that question, but I wonder if, yeah, just bringing it back to thinking about the differences between the gaming world and the theatre world, and what one can bring to the other. The thought that I'm just having now is what the theatre, well, something that the theatre tradition brings with it is value placed in the artist or artists, but the sort of shamanic figure who is managing, who is facilitating the interface between the people participating and what it is they are doing, and that figure and the responsibility invested in them is really, really important. So there's potentially something going on there that is missing in this online, well, in certain online gaming forums, where I mean, I'm not very familiar with that world, but I'm sort of imagining where some tools are handed out, but it's very the facilitation potentially is more minimal. The idea, yeah, facilitation is an interesting idea.
Yeah. Georg, is facilitation, is that a possibility?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about 4chan quite a bit when about this particular theme, and I worked with a Colombian musician for quite a while who, for reasons I didn't quite understand, was fascinated with 4chan and kept on showing me things. And they did a huge amount of this collaborative writing exercises that Kesia had just led. There was an entire channel dedicated to so-called Big Bang Theory reaction memes. So someone would prompt a scene from Big Bang Theory, and then people would write like the most absurd reaction, similar to what we have done now. But the interesting thing is, in 2008, this community, and I'm actually quoting The Guardian here, The Guardian described 4chan in 2008 as lunatic, juvenile, brilliant, ridiculous, and alarming, and in 2022 as far right. So I think these channels had many channels, not just 4chan, also like all sorts of other platforms, Tumblr, etc. They went through phases probably more than a decade ago, where they had this like freshness, like everything was allowed. But I think the world has moved on from, just because everything is allowed, things are brilliant, like we're not there anymore whatsoever. We are in a different place. And the other massive thing that has changed is that, and that's something for political researchers, particularly some of my German colleagues that went quite deep on that one. These places have become recruiting grounds for fascist organizations, period. And they are actively using the demographic that kind of dwells on there to like foster their political work. And this has to be said, and of course, the community, then this is a community you have to control, unless you're not bothered by the growth of fascism, which is okay if you're a fascist,
Yeah.
But that's the only reason why the only person who should not be bothered by that. There are other fascists.
It's something that Ashton spoke about quite a lot in the first webinar, and I think it's an oversimplification, but as I understand it, in the kind of realm of like criminology and sociology, the question is how much of these what's the difference between men, it's mainly men or just people who are going to these forums and saying the most obscene things and sharing the most obscene content, doing it as an act of transgression, like a genuine kind of role play, this is not my real life, to those true believers. And then in terms of how you react to it, that's because there are only a finite amount of resources that you're going to surveil everyone, then perhaps people focused on the true believers. Now, I've got no idea how you would determine that in an online environment. It feels, and we do get in then to the realm of Prevent. So the Prevent is the UK's anti-extremism policy, which is very controversial because it puts the onus not just on lawmakers and enforcers such as police and courts and security service to monitor people. It's put on people like us, like academics and teachers, to monitor what our students are doing and saying. And it's incredibly subjective what could be seen as an extremist content, because someone could be reading Mein Kampf. Doesn't mean they're a Nazi. It means that they might be doing research to understand Naziology to fight it. But that could be a red flag. So I'm very I'm wary of when because this is kind of where I'm like, if it's either it feels at the moment, the question is either Wild West internet of everyone being absolutely obscene, say what you like, do what you like online, and we act like it doesn't have effects in the offline world, which isn't true, or we go down the surveillance route of monitoring everything. Now, again, that binary is, there are many other options. I'm just trying to think, and I think what this project is asking, are theatre and the arts able to make an intervention into that space to say there are other ways of we can have a very exciting, dynamic online life without it being co-opted by extremists and fascists. So I just put gone. Yeah.
I have two things about Kesia. Do you have anything to say? Because I don't want to
no, I sort of just wanted to build off of that with a kind of add-on question for you, which is because you've been talking about using the medium of games as a way of fighting fire with fire, so using the same coming through the same medium to offer alternatives, I guess, and designing games for social change. And wondering what are there kind of regulatory principles in designing these games that are more of the online gaming side of things than potentially things that are more on the theatre side. What kinds of regulatory principles do you find work for creating those spaces?
I mean, it's a question if you need regulation or if you need curation, you know. And I think particular, like vulnerable community, and as a queer person, you know, like I'm also part of communities that I know, they require protection, you know. Like the Queer Developer Association, and I'm a very unvulnerable person just from my sheer physique, I'd say. But there is people in our community that don't need exposure to like hateful fascists, you know, in our community channels, you know. And the same goes for for the trans artists we work with. They have a very particular community. What they don't need is, you know, joyful shenanigans and Nazi hentai stuff because people feel like, and racist slurs that people throw around. These communities should be as protected as the members of these communities require. However, in the discourse of games, I think that that we can use like game design and game-based media, you know, be it game art, game theater, or like pure digital games, to reach a demographic that can really relate to this, because, you know, they can really relate to games and they can maybe not relate to culture, and then expose them to political content they're not used to. And now I come to my example that I wanted to say. We actually managed to be featured in the Daily Stormer with our game on. I'm
sure they loved you.
You know, it was really strange. The story went like this: we wanted to go to the UK, me and my colleague from Syria.
So,
and
sorry, Dave, can you just explain what the Daily Stormer is for those who?
Oh yeah, the Daily Stormer is an American far-right neo-Nazi white supremacist, philosopher, anti-Semitic, and Holocaust denying. Media outlet. I think they might even had like a newspaper of a sort. It's kind of a message board these days, I guess. And the strange thing is, we were invited to the UK. The UK, you know, glorious as it is, the Home Office denied our visa application. We did a bit of a media fuss. It was reported, and then the Daily Stormer came and said, like, well, isn't that a shame? Here's a young, educated Arab person, and they're letting all the knife-wielding Afghanis into the country, but not this young guy. And I'm like, what is going on? Daily Stormer is writing an article.
So it was in support of you. It was
saying, in support. And the way how they could connect to my colleague was because he was a very dapper and eloquent game designer, you know, who presented his game, you know, was very, very strong in the media with that. When this project Path Out came out, they could really, and that was the weird thing, you know, they could relate to this story because of the constant perpetuation of my colleague that his identity is the identity of a gamer, That's which really is the case, It's like, I'm not an Arab, I'm a gamer. I'm much more comfortable being a gamer than an Arab or a Muslim recently, since he's moved away from religion. And this created a very strange space for people who would not normally even be remotely interested in the entire refugee theme to connect to this particular person. And I think, we have to find ways, whatever it could be, to somehow bridge into these kind of spaces, and see what kind of media can still, you don't have to reach the neo-Nazis, but I think it's good to reach out for the 14-year-olds that might be already visiting sometimes these neo-Nazi boards, because they're bored and they're in Wisconsin and I don't know, or even worse in Essex.
Yeah, and the current discourse around free speech, we're entering into farcical territory where if you don't, certainly in Britain, if you don't tolerate Nazis on university campuses, somehow you're anti-democratic. So is democracy then what? Tolerating Nazism? We're in a very dangerous space. And Aurelian, who's in the last seminar, speaks very well about this, like how fascism and liberalism are not inimical to each other at all. So fascists have always historically relied on the freedoms liberal societies give them to spread their hate. So I've just got a question in the chat, and we're coming to the end, so I want to just try and squeeze this in. So Gemma, I'm going to read your question very quickly. So thank you for the question. Scholars and artist designers like Galloway, Flanagan and Schleiner have extensively written about the concept of radical game design and the avant-garde potential of video games in creating politically engaged works that address social and cultural issues. Many artists, there's a list there, create machinimas, I hope I'm saying that right, or use the practice of in-game photography as a means to repurpose and refunctionalize AAA video games to create counter-narratives and political visual commentaries. Actually, these practices were already developed by avant-garde movements such as Dada and the Situationist International after the second half of 1900. What is your point of view on these practices? Do you think that they are hybrid in nature in between contemporary art and video games? Can be a limit to their real potential in fighting far-right ideas? Oh, does their hybrid nature limit their potential? Right. Thanks, Gemma. So that could be for either of you.
It's a lot to process.
Yeah.
I can do a tiny take on that. I think the moment it, and I even know the people from Total Refusal personally, not too well, but Austria is a very small scene. The moment you manage to actually leave, the little circles of art and actually start to reverberate in like the bigger realms of game development, as David O'Reilly's Everything, for example, managed, then you can really go somewhere. But I think you need to be able to function beyond the arts. I know a lot of people who work with machinimas and game engines who do terrific aesthetic work, and you see it in galleries and maybe even buy it as NFTs, if that's your thing. But I think if it stays in the arts, it has maybe an impact in the art, but not in the impact of video game culture, because video game culture is not observing whatever happens in culture, in visual arts, for example.
Yeah, I'm not so familiar with the practices that are described here, but I definitely don't think that hybridizing cultural forms limits potential. I'd be interested to ask back to Janet, like in what ways does it limit potential? Maybe by corrupting the thrust of something, but I think by hybridizing cultural forms, by hybridizing sort of arts, as Georg was saying, with other forms of culture that appeal to different groups of people, you are strengthening reach, and also constantly hybridizing is constantly coming up with new possibilities and new ways of bringing people together to think. And I would love to do a bit more thinking as well about. I sort of touched on it earlier, talking about maybe the importance of the artist figure in a more arts or theatre tradition, but to think about what is it that we do actually value about the theatre tradition and the high art traditions that we can bring the other way. It's sort of very easy to talk about because these worlds are so exclusive. It's very easy to talk about what gaming can bring in order to democratize those practices, but it's also super useful, I think, to think about what do we value about those traditions that can maybe give us windows into how we can use game and online forums in ways that don't foster what Georg called, I've also noted down, cesspools of toxicity. And yeah, there are things like importance of a kind of creators and facilitation between people participating and what it is you're participating in, but also thinking of theatre in particular, a value placed on bodies and co-presence, which I would really like to bring that idea into the conversation, even though we have just a little bit of time left. And how can we, when we are talking about forms that are connecting people remotely, bring the importance of the fact that we are actually physically somewhere and we are actual physical people connecting with each other into those forms without necessarily being very proximal.
Yeah, and I just want to, because we are just coming to the end, and I hope, Jeremy, you don't mind if I just respond to your question as well. I really appreciate what Kesia has just said about the craft of theatre. You have to do that gesture when you say that, craft of theatre. Because I'm always torn between, sometimes us in theatre, we can forget the absolute fundamentals, that a proscenium arch staging of a story is not lesser than an interactive artwork. It's very valuable and important, and I think that and when you say you're an artist, that comes with a set of responsibilities, I would say, and expectations, and it is a craft. It's not reality, and therefore, and what Kesia said around, and then both of you said this, that stories are sense making. The proscenium art stage, that gives you a perspective, and you can see a world, and it gives you a certain distance whilst also being co-present that can make sense of the world for you in a new way. That being immersed, to use that word, can dilute or confuse, because your role, you're there to make the world that you're trying to make sense of, which is what the world is all the time, always trying to make sense of it and live in it at the same time. And I think we sometimes underestimate the value of watching, witnessing, encountering. And I really thought about this when I saw a show called The Destroyed Room in 2017. I've never seen what it's like to talk on social media better than that show, and that was an end-on show. And the one thing I do worry, Gemma, in response to a question about the hybrid work, that there is a certain direction you can go in with this work, where particularly around works like historical reenactments and works like Exhibit B, where you might feel empathetic for the situation and people that you're encountering and characters, to an extent where you might convince yourself, I know what it was like to be a slave, or I know what it was like to go through the Holocaust, and which is very dangerous, because then you've lost that distance which you need to understand politics and history, and to really understand that this is only a representation, it's not reality. And as we go into the metaverse, whatever the hell that will be, maybe it'll be nothing, maybe it'll be another Google Glasses, but there is a risk that as the virtual and the analog physical becomes completely, oh, that's the alarm saying we have to finish, hybridized, that we lose that sense of our corporeal, fleshy selves. So on that note, thank you. I want to thank, we do have to close now, so I want to thank Georg and Kesia fulsomely. So I'm just going to give you a clap, and I know we'll get digital claps as well. Wonderful talk. We could speak for a lot longer. There was so much we didn't get to speak about: utopia, freedom in online worlds, but no, this is absolutely brilliant. So thanks everyone for coming. This is the last webinar of the series. We hope to do another series later this year. I'll post this online and email to everyone. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your summer. And thank you for everyone who's writing messages in the chat. So bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.